Ever since Vladimir Putin marched his troops into Ukraine, Europe has almost unanimously supported the invaded country. Billions of dollars in aid, constant reassurance of continued support, and even European politicians helping Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky deal with political turbulence have all underscored Europe's collective commitment to Ukraine. And now we may know one of the reasons why Europe is putting all of its eggs into the Ukrainian victory basket. It's not just that Europe believes Putin is wrong, though that is a huge part of it. As a recent study revealed, Ukraine's victory is Europe's only real chance to stop Russia, and the reason why comes down to something that has influenced the Ukraine war from its very beginning: money. On November 30th, the Kyiv Post reported on a recent study conducted by a team of Norwegian experts that examined the cost of the two possible scenarios that could emerge from the war. The team took several factors into account, including the political, defense, economic, and humanitarian costs of the scenarios, which were a partial win for Russia and a partial win for Ukraine. Based on the figures the study produced, there can be only one conclusion: Europe needs Ukraine to win against Russia. If it doesn't, the cost to Europe will be enormous. Not that it won't be if Europe continues to fund and support Ukraine. However, the study argues that the cost of the latter approach will be far lower than the cost of the former. The study even made several assumptions, one of which is that the US will end its support for both the Ukrainian and European defense sectors. The researchers also assumed that Europe will foot the majority of the bill in both scenarios, albeit with some support from the likes of Japan and Canada. Still, the outcome is the same: Ukraine has to win. And the scenarios prove it. Starting with the first scenario, which is a partial Russian victory, the study asks what the ultimate cost of a Russian victory will be to Europe and its allies if Russia is able to neutralize Ukraine both politically and militarily. The scenario assumes Russia achieves decisive military victories, occupies more land westwards toward the Dnipro River, and succeeds in pressuring Ukraine into a clearly disadvantageous peace settlement, the Kyiv Post says. Euromaidan Press adds that a partial Russian victory would mean that Europe has to spend heavily to prepare for a potential war with Russia. This is something that has already been suggested by several prominent European figures. For instance, June saw Germany's Chief of Defense, Carsten Breuer, suggest that NATO's defense now faces a very serious threat from Russia, the likes of which he hasn't seen in 4 decades of military service. That threat is so massive, the German defense chief claims, that Russia could be ready to launch an attack on NATO within the next 4 years. That creates a potential deadline of 2029 for Europe to get ready. And that deadline might be pulled forward if Russia achieves a partial victory in Ukraine. The study states that Europe's main costs would come from having to reinforce its eastern flank to prevent Putin from turning his attention to the Baltic states of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. Europe may also have to deal with millions of Ukrainian refugees that will flood into Europe to escape Putin's rule, which will add further pressure to the state budgets of the European Union's or EU's members. NATO wouldn't escape the costs either. Putin shifting his attention to the Baltic states, which are all NATO members, would mean that NATO would collectively have to spend to reinforce its eastern front. Not even the US would escape. With Ukraine handled, Putin would also be able to more heavily invest in his interests in the Arctic region, which affects the likes of Finland, Canada, and the United States. The refugees alone, which the study claims could number between 6 and 11 million, would cost the EU up to 275 billion euros, or around $319 billion per year. In a worst-case scenario, Ukraine will become a so-called failed state, the report claims, suggesting that Russia would run Ukraine into the ground and then populate it with its own people. So we come to the total cost of the first scenario. The EU's members would have to spend between 1.5% and 2.5% of their gross domestic product on dealing with a post-Ukraine war world where Russia is the eventual winner. Beyond the money dedicated to dealing with Ukrainian refugees, Europe would have to spend 256 billion euros, or over $297 billion, on rearming the Baltic states and the Nordic positions of the Arctic. Increased support for Ukraine would also be required, and the money spent on Ukraine's refugees is an annual figure. The study examines what would happen in the 4 years following the conclusion of the Ukraine war. So you can multiply the cost of dealing with refugees by 4 and add the other costs to it to get a total of between 1.4 and $1.8 trillion of European spending. That is an astronomical figure for Europe to spend in 4 years, and it may not even take into account the EU's many members spending more heavily on their own defenses to guard themselves against potential future invasions by Russia. Then there's a second scenario. Ukraine achieves a partial victory. The specific question asked by the study is, what are the costs of enabling Ukraine to resist Russian attacks and regain the opportunity for limited counteroffensive? In this scenario, Ukraine manages to completely halt all Russian expansion beyond what has already been achieved. In addition to gaining the air defense coverage required to minimize, if not outright neutralize, Russia's aerial strikes. That latter point may be the most important in this particular equation. Russia has unleashed record numbers of missiles and drones at Ukraine in 2025. ABC News says that October alone saw Russia launch 5,312 drones of all types at Ukraine, along with 270 missiles. Better air defenses limit the damage these weapons can do, in addition to forcing Russia to spend more on these airstrikes to get anything like the results that it's achieving right now. The study adds that these Ukrainian successes would force Russia to change its strategic calculus, eventually forcing Russia to end hostilities. Likely, this would be due to Russia no longer being able to afford the war that Putin started, suggesting that Ukraine will be able to negotiate to get much, if not all, of its territory back. Again, the study looked at the costs of this scenario over 4 years, and the numbers show that it's the much cheaper option. The EU would still have to spend big in this scenario. Euromaidan Press says that the study reports a potential outlay of €838 billion, which amounts to $972 billion. That would cost the European countries 0.9% of their GDP, which you can already see is far lower than the amount spent in the event of a partial Russian victory. In this case, the EU's expenditure would be on providing Ukraine with 8 million drones, or at least providing the funding that allows Ukraine to build these drones itself. Ukraine would also use this money to supply 95 of its brigades, in addition to procuring 2,500 battle tanks it can use to defend itself against Russia and potentially begin pushing back to lines of contact. There are other factors at play in the second scenario. For instance, the study assumes that Russia will be so desperate to end the war that Putin started that Europe will be able to use the frozen Russian assets to cover almost half of the cost it incurs due to a partial Ukrainian victory. Right now, the majority of the roughly $300 billion in frozen Russian assets is held in Europe, with €185 billion, or about $214 billion, being held by Euroclear alone. Presumably, the study assumes that this money, plus the interest it gains over the next 4 years, would all be used, making the European bill even smaller in the event that it provides the required support to Ukraine. Refugees are also another factor to consider, and not just in terms of cost. If Ukraine achieves a partial victory against Russia, the EU won't have to deal with the flood of refugees that would result. That means less chaos at the borders and less strain placed on EU countries, both economically and culturally, in the long term. The study suggests that 1.5 million Ukrainians who have already fled their country will return home after Russia withdraws, which would offer more relief to the nations that are hosting those refugees. While there are plenty of assumptions made in both scenarios, the headline is pretty clear. It will cost Europe around $428 billion to around $828 billion less to not only continue supporting Ukraine, but to ramp that support up, compared to a scenario in which Russia is allowed to score a partial victory. Adding to that massive financial difference is the change in Europe's global geopolitical makeup. A Russia that loses is a country that is less likely to start fights in the Baltic and Arctic regions. Europe and NATO can't get complacent in those regions, but it wouldn't have to spend anywhere near as much on defending them as it otherwise would, and a neutered Russia would be much easier to handle. There's also Putin to consider. The study doesn't mention the possible fate of Russia's president if the second scenario is achieved, but it likely won't be good. Putin has spent heavily on the Ukraine war and would dedicate hundreds of billions of dollars more of Russia's money to more fighting in Scenario 2. Russia's economic backbone is already breaking in 2025, as you will discover if you check out our video covering the country's many economic woes. 4 years down the line, it seems unlikely that Putin will be able to survive as Russia's president if all of that spending achieves the grand total of nothing. He might be forced out, killed, or become a lame duck president with no real geopolitical or domestic power. The study's authors are pretty clear about which of the other two scenarios offers the best for Europe. We argue that the second scenario may change the Russian cost-benefit calculus and thereby offer the most realistic path to negotiations that can end the war, the researchers state. Negotiations that can end the war. That's what all of this is really about. And it's smart of the study authors to state that. It's unlikely that Putin will ever end his Ukraine invasion willingly. He has too much tied into his supposed special military operation that has lasted close to 4 years longer than he ever intended. Pressure has to be placed on Putin to negotiate, and Europe should be doing everything that it can to create that pressure via its support of Ukraine. But will Europe do that? It's one thing to point out hundreds of billions of dollars will be saved if Europe supports Ukraine rather than allowing the country to submit to a partial Russian victory. It's quite another for Europe to follow through on this advice and actually achieve the more desirable second scenario. And if that scenario is to be achieved, the study claims, then the EU has to do two things and do them quickly. Take the initiative in the Ukraine war peace talks and find a way to deal with an out-of-touch United States, perhaps by cutting the US out of peace discussions entirely. We'll deal with taking the initiative first. The European Parliament has itself stated that it's about time that Europe snatched the impetus that drives the peace negotiations away from the United States and Russia. In a November 27th article, the Parliament reported on a resolution passed by its members that said the EU should do precisely what the Norwegian researchers say it should do. Following recent initiatives by the US administration to end the war, plenary adopted a resolution by 401 votes in favour, 70 against, and with 90 abstentions, urging the EU and its member states to show leadership in this crucial geopolitical moment and continue working with Washington and other like-minded partners to ensure that negotiations for a just and lasting peace respect the principles of international law, the European Parliament said. The European newsroom expanded on this news, noting that several members of the European Parliament, or MEPs, were far too behind the curve when it came to the 28-point peace plan that the Trump administration created toward the end of November. Referring to that plan, the Dutch MEP Thijs Ruiten blared that we had once again no other choice but to react in panic to a very flawed plan that bears the stamp of Moscow. Another MP, Reinier van Lanschot, echoed those statements, adding that Europe arrived 1 minute before 12 to support Ukraine and prevent a disaster, before delivering a thunderous reproach to the US by adding that Europe must overcome its inferiority complex because it has everything it takes to become what the US is no longer, a united democracy that defends freedom. Frustration is growing within the European Parliament, which is starting to characterize the EU as a toothless organization that isn't doing enough to lead the peace negotiations between Ukraine and Russia. Instead, the EU reacts to what the Trump administration does, perhaps out of fear that the US might withdraw support. The Norwegian study was purposefully created under the assumption that US support was already lost, perhaps with the goal of showcasing that Europe is still better off if Ukraine achieves a partial victory than if Russia does, even without American help. But right now, the US leads the charge, and that may create problems if Europe doesn't act soon. On December 1st, Zelensky himself noted that America's proposal to offer territorial concessions to Russia as part of a peace deal is the most problematic of the 28 points that the Trump administration concocted. That deal would have granted Russia much of the Donbass region that Putin wants, in addition to placing severe restrictions on Ukraine. Europe collectively helped to smooth things over, but it's still the US that's in the driver's seat. That's demonstrated by the fact that its US envoys, including Trump's favorite envoy, Steve Witkoff, will be meeting with Putin on December 2nd in Russia. European representatives are nowhere to be found in that meeting, and The Guardian reports that the EU's foreign policy chief, Kaja Kallas, is already expressing concern over the possibility that the meeting between the US and Russia will add more pressure on Ukraine. That will especially be the case if the US exits that meeting under the impression that it has to prioritize what Putin wants over what is best for Ukraine. I'm afraid that all the pressure will be put on the victim, which is that Ukraine has to make concessions and obligations, Kallas said about the meeting, which may very well be happening as you watch this video. Whereas in order to have peace, we shouldn't lose focus that it's actually Russia who started this war, and Russia that is continuing this war, and Russia that is really targeting civilians and civilian infrastructure every single day to cause as much damage as possible. But that statement really only emphasizes the problem. Europe has failed to take the lead on the Ukraine war peace talks, allowing the US to do so instead. That's a strange decision, given that it's Europe that stands to lose the most if Ukraine is neutered by these peace talks. What Europe collectively needs to realize, the Norwegian researchers seem to be claiming, is that the continent is in a no-win situation when it comes to the financial aspect of the war. It loses in either scenario, but it loses far bigger if Europe continues to play follow the leader with the US, creating more opportunities for Russia to get its partial victory in the process. That brings us to the second thing that the researchers say Europe has to do. Fairly or otherwise, the Norwegian researchers have claimed that the Trump administration is out of touch when it comes to the Ukraine war, particularly in terms of the long-term impact of allowing Putin to get most of what he wants out of a peace deal. Specifically, the researchers claim that the Trump administration is out of touch with the real issues at stake, and that it often misreads what is required to secure a stable and safe Ukraine and Europe. The Norwegian researchers are far from the only ones making this claim. In a November 24th article published just a few days after the Trump administration unveiled its peace plan, The Conversation said that the plan reflects how the inexperienced and unrealistic members of the Trump administration are a poor choice for handling such a delicate diplomatic situation. The outlet spoke to former diplomat and current Tufts University's Fletcher schoolteacher Donald Heflin about the situation, who said, "It's amateur hour. We've seen this before. With this administration, it puts a lot of very amateurish people, Rubio's not one of them, in place in important offices like Steve Witkoff, the special envoy for Russia and Ukraine, who is also the special envoy for the Middle East, and they've gotten rid of all the professionals. They either just fired some or ran some off." Similar criticism against the US peace plan has come from elsewhere within America itself. The Independent quotes Daniel Fried, who is the former US ambassador to Poland, who says that America's initial 28-point plan was so bad that it could presage a strategic defeat for Ukraine, for Europe, and for the free world generally. He adds that it's a good thing that the plan has been redrafted, and it now appears that Trump and his cabinet may realize that enabling such a plan could have amounted to Trump's big defeat. But the fact that the plan was released in such a pro-Russian state at all may raise the question of why the current US administration didn't realize just how damaging it could be. A similar outcry has come from the US volunteers who are helping Ukraine in its war effort on Ukraine's own soil. The Guardian reports that one Special Forces veteran who has helped to train and advise Ukraine's military ever since Putin launched his invasion labeled the plan complete bullshit and a betrayal by Trump. That's a damning statement. And it provides circumstantial evidence that the US may be as out of touch as the Norwegian researchers claim. In this case, Europe has to take the lead, not only to flex its considerable yet underused muscles, but also to remove the Trump administration from the negotiating table altogether. Nevertheless, it's still the US that is leading the negotiation charge. It was American representatives who met a Ukrainian delegation in Florida toward the end of November. US Secretary of State Marco Rubio labeled those conversations productive but complicated. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and his team are heading to Moscow as we create this video to present a plan to Putin, and who knows what the outcome of that meeting will be. Europe, as seems to be so often the case, is on the sidelines, waiting to respond to whatever happens. If the Norwegian researchers are right, that situation needs to change so that Europe takes the lead. Ensuring Ukraine gets the support it needs, with or without the US, may be the only chance there is to stop Putin's war of aggression from expanding well outside Ukraine's borders. Perhaps Europe could start by helping Ukraine to build more of its powerful Sea Baby maritime drones so that it can tackle the Russian Shadow Fleet. Those drones have proven themselves to be extremely effective, as they took out a pair of Russian shadow tankers very recently. Find out more about these amazing strikes and why Ukraine wants to conduct more of them in our video. And if you enjoyed this video, remember to subscribe to The Military Show for more up-to-date coverage of the Ukraine war. And thank you for watching.